Debbie, I really appreciate you making time to have this conversation today. Yeah, it's been a while in the making, and I really appreciate your time. Thanks for being here.
Of course, of course. I'm really looking forward to this as well.
So, launching off point for this conversation, I was thinking about what you're responsible for at the bank, and you're responsible for the hypo development for 5,000 managers. And I was thinking about that, like anyone with a lens of hypo development, high potential development for that many leaders is going to see the themes, is going to hear what's on leaders' minds today in a way that a lot of people don't have that kind of sample size to work with. So I'm curious, as you reflect on what you're hearing from the leaders that you're responsible for developing, what are the themes, what are the things that are coming up from them right now?
Yeah, well, yeah, 5,000 managers, I know that seems like a lot, right? I definitely feel more and more that when we talk about hypo talent, it's really the what we call the cream of the crop, right? And in many ways, these are the people that are also tapped to do way too much because they're high performers, they're a high potential talent. And what I'm hearing from this particular group, I would say this is about 30% of the population. Maybe that's overly generous, but anyway, 25 to 30%. Really, what's on their minds, I would say, is balance, being able to keep up with the pace of change, and really trying hard not to be burnt out. In fact, I'm hearing this
Hmm.
more and more. I was running this leadership offsite the other day, and there were a bunch of wealth managers in the room. And I said, hey, what's on your mind? And they all said that equally. And maybe it's because it's, Mike, it's almost the end of the year. So a lot of the leaders are feeling like, wow, I'm feeling a bit tapped out and I'm worried about burnout. One other thing that they often share is that they're feeling like, can I carry the load for my team? Can I head into the new year with new sales targets and revenue targets that are there for me and that I can actually be even more for my people? So yeah, this is definitely, ever present on people's minds for sure. Mm-hmm.
I think what's interesting, like, if we go back in time and, and think about March of 2020 when the pandemic hit, and we think, the two big topics that popped up, aside from remote work, which everybody was kind of forced into, but the other topics that popped up was, around mental health and around burnout and resilience. And during that time, I thought, yeah, well, people are being asked to do more with less, right? There were a lot of layoffs. There were leaders feeling the pressure of not having the same size team and, working remotely in a different way, not being used to that. And I thought, okay, well, we're eventually going to come out of that place and there'll be some sort of sense of normalcy of maybe it's hybrid work or it's, remote first, or but we'll land somewhere. And we're still figuring that out in 2024. Like we're
Yeah,
still having that conversation.
yeah,
And I'm still hearing from leaders that they're feeling burnt out, that they feel that their resilience is taxed, that they feel they're dealing with mental health issues and the people that report to them are dealing with mental health issues. And I really thought that by now we would be in a different place. And
yeah.
I think, I was reflecting on this the other day that when we all went to Zoom and Microsoft Teams or WebEx, whatever your favorite platform is, the challenge was that we no longer had a commute. And so I started noticing with clients that they were working from the beginning of their commute to the end of their commute.
Yeah.
Whereas before they would have, driven to the office and had whatever commute they had or taken transit. And so they would start at a normal hour and it's like their workday extended. And as I talked to
Mhm.
leaders, they also said like, yeah, like I am in my home office a lot, or even if I'm in my office, in our main office, I'm pretty much on Teams and Zoom all day. And I'm kind of pretty much in back to back meetings and I don't really leave my desk. And sometimes I forget to eat or
Yeah.
go outside or like, do the normal things. And that didn't occur for me before 2020. And
Hmm.
so something seems to have shifted in both the expectations that we've set, I guess, for each other, but also of ourselves. And I think that is really helping to contribute to the reality of the burnout that a lot of people are facing today.
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. I'm so glad you raised that because just coming out of the pandemic, I think people felt grateful that there was that time they could be at home, spend more time with family while also working. But at the same time, like you said, risking burnout because there didn't seem to be any beginning and end to the workday, right?
Mm-hmm.
So fast forward to today, now there's more and more of a mandate for people to come back into the office 4 days a week, 5 days a week. And I think that struggle continues to happen for a lot of our leaders. And the ones that have spoken up, they've said openly, they said, now I'm back to my 1.5 hour commute. I go
Mm-hmm.
in and then I really got to show up and be there for my team and then, go back to commuting and all that. I think that burnout that a lot of people are feeling now is not being able to do everything and to reach their goals and their targets while also connecting with their teams who are hybrid. So it's not like we've come out of the pandemic and okay, we're now all in the office. Well, actually, not every company, certainly not mine, where we're all back in the office 5 days a week. We're still working with hybrid teams. We're still working on global teams and struggling with the time zone differences. I think all this to say, at the heart of it is the strive for perfection. I
Mm-hmm.
find that a lot of leaders come right out and say, I want to be there for my team. I need to be able to manage everything. Everything has to be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I say, is it really that, is that really the goal to be perfect? And what happens if you don't get to perfect, and so that mindset shift continues to be an uphill battle for a lot of people, which is why we spend a lot of time with our leaders to help them readjust expectations and to be empathetic with themselves. I don't think perfection is the only goal here.
I think I agree with you. I think one of the challenges is that like perfection is actually the enemy of progress,
Yes.
right? And Plato had this wonderful quote, and I'm paraphrasing it just to take out the masculine part of it. But effectively, Plato's quote was, "Never judge a person who is making progress, no matter how slow that progress is." And
Ooh.
perfection gets in the way of that. And I think leaders looking not just at perfection, also a never-ending task list. Like I think most leaders are really good at like adding on things to their plate, right?
Yes.
Like you add on, we got a to-do list, I got my calendar, I'll fill it up, and they just kind of keep filling it up. I see a lot of leaders struggling with there's no stop doing list. Like,
Mm.
what's the process for stopping doing a thing? And if you're good at creating habits, one of the challenges is that you can just create more and more habits. And then one day
Right.
you wake up and you're like, how am I so exhausted all the time? Like I'm doing all the things I'm supposed to be doing. But then it's just like this never ending pile on list. And I think leaders sitting down and actually looking at, am I in reaction mode to the things that are being brought to me? Or am I being responsive and proactive and actually responsive and proactive and actually looking at the things on my plate and saying, is it really feasible to do all these things? Or
Yeah.
maybe it isn't. And I need some way of prioritizing the over the urgent, because it's always easy to deal with the urgent tasks that come in, but maybe those aren't the most important things. And I think there's a big push on YouTube right now. There's a lot of people that talk about time blocking, and time blocking
Mhm.
is effectively to say, I'm going to block out time in my day to work on the important, not urgent things. And I'm going to hold that time as sacred as I would hold a meeting with like a key client or my boss or something like that. And that strategy is helping leaders get to a place where they can actually look at their week and say, I can actually make progress on things. But it also, when you time block, all of a sudden you're like, not all this fits. So
Mhm.
maybe I can't do all this stuff, right? And without that, it's just you can just have this never-ending pile-on. So that's one thing I'm seeing leaders who are trying to deal with this overwhelm use time blocking as a technique.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Time blocking. That is a really good technique you just shared because that really helps people manage what is realistic and feasible and all that. I think it's also about leaders being honest. You know,
Yeah.
being honest with themselves about what they can or cannot tackle. I find when I'm working with leaders, there's a certain level of perfection slash control.
Right.
And let's face it, right? We're all kind of control freaks, and we're all type A in many ways. I find that when I'm working with leaders that there's this unbelievable correlation with being able to tackle it all. And at the same time, everything has to be perfect. And also wanting to have full control over what that looks like.
Hmm.
I love this quote that from Anne Lamott, one
Hmm.
of my favorite authors, and she said that help is the sunny side of control. And I love that quote.
That's
I love
great.
that quote because when I'm working with leaders, they often say, yeah, I'm helping my team. I'm telling them what to do and they should be doing it this way. And then I get upset when it doesn't look exactly like that. And then I question
Hmm.
them and say, is that really helping the team figure it out for themselves? And so in the name of help, we tend to be controlling and wanting to step in and making it exactly as it should be. And then hence burnout, right? When things don't work out the way that you want it to be. Yeah. What do you think, Mike?
Well, I think this, like, you bring up the issue of control. And I think one of the challenges, like, Stoicism talks a lot about this, right? Like, we have our reason choice. Those are the things we have control over. But, like, the reality is the rest of life, we don't have control over it. We have the illusion that we have control. And then when that illusion gets taken away, that's when we get anxious and that's when we get stressed. And the reality is we never really had control in the first place. And I feel like for leaders to understand that it's an illusion, um,
Hmm.
and that change is a constant, not something to be feared, but like something to recognize is always going to be there. And so it's not about, oh, I hope the pace of change slows down, because I don't think that's going to be the case. Things like
Yeah.
AI coming out are accelerating the pace of change. There's an article with a one of the lead software developers at Microsoft, and he said that he's using AI to do 30% of his work,
Hmm.
but he's just as busy as he has ever been.
Wow. And why do
Right.
you
And I
think so?
think, well, I think because we were sold a bill of goods, right? Like, oh, because I've got this tool called AI, all of a sudden I'm going to get all this free time because AI is going to do my work. And what happened for him is he's like, well, no, I can now be more productive with the same hours. And so there's this
Hmm.
piece about that that's like, work expands to fill the time allotted to it. So if
Yeah.
I allot, if that developer said works 40 or 50 hours a week, he's a more senior person at Microsoft. So I'm assuming he's probably in that range or higher. He's got a tool like, ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot that enables him to be more efficient as a coder. He still has the same schedule. It's just
Hmm.
filled with more. And of course, if he's got, life abhors a vacuum, and a lot of organizations abhor a vacuum. And if they see that there's a vacuum in someone's role, the organization will figure out how to fill that. And so,
Interesting.
yeah. And so it's just like a quest for efficiency will never fix our time management problems. It like, you can't win it because you become more efficient, and then you're like, oh, great, now I can do more with the same time I've allotted to it. So the issue that leaders struggle with is actually a boundary issue. Like, how do I
Yeah.
set up my own personal boundaries and hold myself accountable for those boundaries? Because if I don't
Hmm.
have that, it's an unfixable problem.
That's right. Oh my goodness. That is so fascinating about what you just shared. Because I think that all of us, me included, when there's that extra bit of time afforded to us, rather than taking a moment and reflecting or strategically thinking about, a project you might be working on, we zoom in on filling up that time.
Yeah.
And it can be never ending. And I'm guilty of that. I know that there was a conversation I had with some senior managers. Actually, it was earlier this week where they were sharing with me that the the changes are happening so fast that there's not even a time to pause. And then when we were we did this employee survey of their direct reports. They said, we want to stop. We want to pause and reflect. So it's interesting the messages we're hearing from team members and what they need and what leaders are actually facing. And so one of the interventions that we try to do is putting together a workshop that allows people to pause, right? And
Mm.
build that into their everyday. And in this workshop, we're saying, okay, we're going to turn everything off for a moment and we're going to think and reflect, what have we done already? What is happening currently? And what do we want to do moving forward? And it's really been interesting. And I think a lot of people were resistant at first, Mike, because they're saying, well, we don't have time for that. We don't have time for that. We're actually making time for
The
this.
irony of that statement. Yeah.
The irony. So they're making time for that. And the time allocated to this just 30 minutes is just immensely impactful and helpful. I do think that it's like the word boundaries, right? That
Hmm.
that continues to be a never ending thing. I know that the leaders that we're often working with complain a lot about the boundaries because it's a lot that's out of their control, right? It's
Hmm.
coming from above, the changes or all the work that we got to do, our sales targets, everything. However, what we try to do, what I find helpful for some leaders who are open to it, is focusing on what they can control.
Hmm.
I think that's immensely helpful for them to be thinking about not trying to do it all, not trying, for things to be perfect, but to focus on what they can control, where they have the greatest impact, and to prioritize. Yeah.
I think there's a great book on this. Greg McKeown wrote these two books. One's called Essentialism. Essentialism is effectively like, how do I
Yes.
figure out what I can be a hell yes to? What do I need to stop saying a lukewarm yes to? And then the rest of the things
Mm-hmm.
I have to say no. But even when you've prioritized what is truly essential, you still may not have enough time, as leaders have said to you, right, to get it all done. And so he wrote this follow up book called Effortless. And he's like, Effortless was really about when you decide what's essential, how do you figure out the least amount of effort possible to accomplish that activity? Sometimes that means delegation. Sometimes that means figuring out what the minimum viable product could be. But it flies in the face of perfectionism because
Yeah.
perfectionism would say, what's the very best job I could do with this? The question is the very best job required in this instance? Because in a lot of times, it just isn't. And
No.
so when you think about less about the task and think about the outcome the task is creating, it opens up the creativity and the possibility that there may be a way to accomplish the same outcome with less effort. And of course, I'm sure some listeners are like, are you basically you're describing being lazy? And I'm like, no, it's not that. It's That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that sometimes we over engineer the results. Like we think that we need to create some sort of grandiose outcome with everything that we are tasked with. And the reality is, it's one, it's impossible. Two, it's exhausting. And three, it can be debilitating to be
Mm-hmm.
living in that place. And so instead, the question is, well, what are the other ways of me accomplishing this task? Who else can help me with this task? Who's already done this? So instead of putting any thought into how I'm going to do this, who already knows how to do this? Or who could I get to help me? Or who could I delegate this to? And
Yeah.
the other thing is, a lot of times when leaders are given tasks, they're not given a time frame. And so everything they're given all of a sudden feels urgent. And so simply asking the person who has a request of you, when do you need this back by? And if the answer in my mind is like, well, they probably wanted ASAP, and the response is, well, actually, I'm going on vacation. So, like, I don't know, next Friday is fine.
Yeah.
Right. All of a sudden, it's like, oh man, I was going to work late tonight to get this for you, not knowing that you're leaving for vacation tomorrow morning and you're not even going to see it till you get back. And I find even with clients, right, when we're working on projects and we ask them the time frame within which they want something back, it always surprises me the level of grace that people will give when you ask that question, where they'll
Mm-hmm.
say, yeah, I think really as long as we had it back by this date, I think it would be great. And that's a completely different conversation. And it allows leaders to then start to be able to understand how to prioritize all the things on their list. So I found
Mm-hmm.
that book in the last probably 5 years, the most helpful I've read to kind of like changing my thought process away from perfectionism and looking at creative ways to get the same outcome, but maybe differently than I initially thought I needed to.
Exactly. You just named my favorite book from last year.
Oh,
So
really? Oh, okay.
cool. Yeah, it's such a good book. And I think that it is a book that can forever be put on your bookshelf and then take it down and take a look at it. And there's some really great nuggets of wisdom in there. You got me thinking, Mike, like, it's the questions that we can ask to determine the clarity around a task. And we don't often do that because we're just running. We're just like, oh, let's just do it. Let's just move on. And so I love that example you gave about, when something is due and the person's going on vacation. I'd love to go back to what you were saying earlier about essentialism.
Mm-hmm.
When I think about why people might feel burnt out and they're struggling with, perfectionism and all that, I think it was also looking at one's childhood and background. Like,
Mm.
myself, I'm Chinese Canadian, I'm born and raised in Vancouver, and I spent about 20 years living in New York City. And so while I was growing up, my father, who is is a lovely man, but also very strict, he
Yeah.
instilled in all of us that things needed to be perfect. So
Right.
Mike, I would come home, I'd be in grade 5, I'd come home with like 95% on my test. And he goes, what happened to the 5%? And
Oh,
so I know. And
yeah.
my
That's
father,
hard.
well, isn't that, and my father, for all that he is, he was wanting so much for us to strive for the best, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I've had to learn and unlearn and relearn what it means for me to show up professionally in my career. And also having spent time in New York City and living abroad as well, just redefining what success means. And I
Mm-hmm.
found that the formula for me, it wasn't working because perfection at 100% means that anything less than 100 is fail. And
Right.
so the stress that I used to feel really had an emotional toll on me. And the point I'm making is that I've had to really reflect on this and also share this with my leaders that, it's about what's good enough.
Mm.
And to your point, what is the best outcome that might not mean that things have to be perfect and
Yeah.
100%. So thanks for reminding me about that. I feel so strongly that it's about honoring how you grew up and the values and the framework that you build success on, and maybe that means looking at that again and reevaluating what that looks like. Mm-hmm.
I think it's a really good point, Debbie, because I think, when we talk about success, I think a lot of people think about it as career success, right? Like that's
Yeah.
what success is. And then yet we're whole human beings, right? Like we're sons and daughters, and we're parents, and we're partners and spouses and friends and family members and cousins, like, uncles and aunts, like we're all these things, and we work. And some of
Yeah.
us might, coach our kids' soccer team or something, right? Like, and so we're all of those roles at the same time. And I think the question that, which I love that you raised this, is like, well, what does success mean in the areas of all the areas of my life? And what do I need to be aware of in terms of where like my very precious heartbeats are going? Where am I devoting those to? Frances Fry did this work at Harvard, and it's just fantastic because she said the research that she did showed that if you tried to be a 5 out of 5 on everything
Mm-hmm.
that you put your mind to, you'll actually end up being a 3 out of 5
Ooh.
because the effort gets diffused between too many competing priorities. And so the
Mm.
quest for perfectionism actually leads to an average outcome. And she said
Interesting.
the actual tough thing to do is to decide, what am I going to be a 5 out of 5 on? And what am I willing to be a 0 or a 1 at?
Wow.
And
Wow.
that's, yeah, I know. The first time I heard her say it, I'm like, okay, I hear you. I'm listening to you. You're right there. And right, I can see that. And then when I read Essentialism, he said, yeah, you got to either be a hell yes, or you got to be a no, or you're going to be a lukewarm yes. And I'm like, oh, that's a 3. A lukewarm yes is a 3. I got it. I got
Oh.
it. Okay. A hell yes is a 5, and a no is a 0 or 1. And all of a sudden it had me looking at the time and energy that I put into all the areas of my life that I want to be successful, and recognizing that burnout would be trying to be a 5 out of 5 on everything. It's just not conceivable. It's chasing
Yeah.
perfectionism. So, what it leads to, though, is a really tough concept, which is leaders' ability to say no. And no is allowed to be a complete sentence, right? Like you don't need to follow it up with anything else. Although most of us feel like we have to editorialize no
Yeah.
because of the following reasons. And I think, if we've got a leader and they are reporting up to someone and their boss has handed them something big, the leaders in their own right should be able to say, hey, what can I deprioritize or stop doing to make time for what you just gave me? Because the thing you just gave me is quite large and I don't have the capacity to accomplish this with the time that I have. Or would you be okay if I got you this outcome? I know you've asked for this whole PowerPoint and everything else. Can I just get you the numbers? Would that be
Mm-hmm.
enough to satisfy your request? And so you almost got to think about it as like it's a negotiation. I mean, life's always a negotiation. And in this case, for a leader, when tasks are getting added, think of it less as like, I have to do this, and think of it more as this is a negotiation with my boss for the very precious resource I have at this company, which is the time I'm able to devote to the work I do. And
Yeah.
that changes the conversation in a way where, as opposed to it just being a yes, no, because that can feel quite binary. And people might
Mm-hmm.
freak out about that, hearing that, saying, well, I can't just say no or hell yes. And it's like, well, you can. And the softer way of doing it is to getting into a negotiation conversation about what you think you can accomplish and when you think you can accomplish it by. And the wild thing is that what I've learned in life is that when people have requests of me, and I say no, they're okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In like most circumstances, they'll figure out a different way. They'll ask someone else, they'll do it themselves, they'll deprioritize it. So I think the thing I struggle with for the longest time, Debbie, was like, okay, when a request is made of me, I feel compelled to say yes right away and give myself up in the process without considering what's the personal impact of that yes. Particularly if the yes is something that's like a ways out. Like if it's like 2 months from now and somebody says, can I meet with you? And I'll say, sure, no problem, because my calendar is empty that week. When the week shows up and my calendar is slammed, now I'm looking at that yes and I'm like, oh man, I said a lukewarm yes. And now if I cancel, I feel awful. If I defer it, I've just made my future me worse off. And so I've really had to learn how to be able to say no respectfully and to be able to learn how to do it and embrace the social consequence that I'm worried about.
Yeah. Like, I'd love it if you could bottle what you just said and share that with some of the investment bankers that I work with, because it's such a
Well, they could listen to
true
this
message.
podcast, right? So,
Yes, that's right. It's really, really important that we have those boundaries because we are at the heart of it, an important person to take care of instead of always running around and taking care of others, right? You got to be thinking about the yes and no thing.
mhm,
What we often try to teach our leaders is you don't have to answer yes to all your people because that's another form of burnout where you're always stepping
right,
in and solving for them. And
right.
it's interesting when we think about it, right? We if we were to always answer and provide the solutions, then we take away the power for our people to figure it out. And our goal is
Mhm,
always for leaders to have team members who are self-reliant problem solvers. That is really ultimately the goal, for them to figure that out. And that applies to team
mhm.
members, teenage kids. It applies to family members across the board. So that's empowerment, right? So it's not saying no. It's no.
Mhm,
I'm not going to answer this for you because I know you know it, and I'm going to empower you to figure that out for yourself. The other part of this is, speaking of boundaries, is understanding and recognizing the boundary we put on ourselves of how we perceive strength and weakness.
mm,
Um, I work at an investment banking firm, and it's hard. It's hard for people to talk about their feelings. And it's even harder for people to be vulnerable and to say, I don't know, or I can't do it. And so they can burn out by trying their hardest mask it or cover it up, or and so I know that a lot of leaders have shared that they'd rather come across as strong in knowing everything. Again, what is everything?
Hmm.
As opposed to admitting, I don't know, because that takes vulnerability and it's perceived as weakness. So a
Hmm.
really big campaign that we started to do was around the time of George Floyd, actually. We did a big empathy campaign where we empowered our leaders to talk to their people and say, how are you feeling about what's going on with George Floyd and all that? And a lot of the leaders pushed back and said, I don't know what to say because I don't know what that means for me or how that
Right.
feels. And it was a really big deal. And we went on this big empathy campaign to equip our leaders to say, it's okay to say you don't know. It's okay to say, I'm scared. It's okay to say, this is an area that I'm not familiar with, but I invite you to have that dialogue with me.
Hmm.
So really great work we've done there. And I'm really proud of how far we've come in this space.
I love that you touched on both problem solving as an affliction for leaders and
Yes.
bravery and vulnerability. And, I think the challenge, like, so you think about the leader journey, right? So imagine, we think about an independent contributor. This is somebody who has perfected their craft, whatever it is. It could be sales, marketing, production, finance, accounting, whatever their task is, social media in the company. And then they got so good that someone made them the manager, and
Yeah.
now they have direct reports. And the message there is, you're so good at what we do that we made you the leader. The challenge is when you become the manager, your job is now to make other people as good as you. That's the
Mm-hmm.
job. And but the problem is, you have such deep technical experience that when people bring problems to you, your natural proclivity is like, well, here's the answer. Right?
Yeah.
Like, I can be the chief problem solver. And that continues all the way up through the ranks, for executives. And the ones that get past that learn to embrace a coaching methodology
Mm-hmm.
where, as you say, they enable the person that's reporting to them to come forward with a challenge. But instead of giving them the answer, they actually coach the person through how to find the answer. And I think the best, sort of the easiest, there's a model called Grow, the Grow coaching model, which is a really easy model to learn
Mm-hmm.
for people to learn how to do it. And I think the best book on the subject would be The Coaching Habit by Michael Bungay Stanier. And I actually had Michael on the podcast recently. So
Oh.
if you're curious about that, he's just released a new book. But his book, The Coaching Habit, is the best-selling book in the last century on coaching. And both the Grow model and the Coaching Habit do a really good job of helping leaders break through that kind of cycle of being chief problem solver to enable development, right? Like, because when you coach somebody, you're saying, I believe you have the capacity to figure this out, and I'm going to coach and guide you towards the outcome. Whereas problem solving is, I'm the smartest person in the room and I'm going to give you the answer. Unfortunately, in that second example, that person leaves your office or leaves the Zoom call as capable as when they entered it. Like, they've got the
Yeah.
answer, but they don't understand how you got there, and they don't have
Yeah.
the development necessary. And so I think that's one of the most critical skills that we see outside of emotional intelligence. I would say a coaching mindset is probably the second most critical skill that a leader can learn to adapt. I know I'm skipping things like giving and receiving and soliciting feedback, also very important. And I would say those emotional intelligence or coaching are pretty critical to a leader being able to make progress in their career, because that's will lead to the developmental conversations they need to have to grow a great team around them.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you raised this such an important topic about coaching. And I love the Grow model. Glad that you also are a big fan of that. It's so critical, right? The questioning skill, and I have to say that that's how I met my husband.
Oh, really?
For a long time when I was dating, I just met all these people that would try to impress me to say, well, I'm a lawyer and oh, I do this. And,
Right.
and what really impressed me about my husband is that instead of like flattering me with all the things he's done in life, he impressed me when he asked great questions like, how did you get
Okay.
into leadership development, or tell me more about what you think about New York, and it just demonstrates that he's listening, that he cares, and that he's curious about me. And so anyway, I use that as, as an example of how you just make so much more of a connection when you're asking good coaching questions of your people. You know, Mike, I if I could also throw another really good author out there, Liz Wiseman.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
she's so amazing. Multiply Leadership. This is
such a
exactly
good book.
right. And when you were saying earlier about, you know, am I an empowering leader, or am I a problem solver? And she
Yeah.
talks a lot about that, right? About being a multiplier leader, like really stepping out of the way and allowing people to figure it out for themselves and to empower them to put forth their best efforts. And we do that through coaching. Or you're an accidental diminisher, right? Where you
Yes, and I love
accidentally,
that she calls it, she doesn't call it problem solving, she calls it diminishing. It's like, oh,
yes,
that's a gut punch, right? Because she's like, do you want to be a multiplier or do you want to be a diminisher? And I'm like, oh, man, that's a
oh,
very easy decision to make. Tell me more about multipliers.
totally. It's like that book really, yeah, speaking of punching you in the gut, like it really made an impact in my life when I first read it,
Yeah.
because I realized that sometimes I'm the bottleneck. I'm the one that's trying to
Yeah.
be helpful when actually I'm taking away someone's ability to figure it out for themselves. It's really a powerful book. Yeah. Yeah.
And just to, for listeners who haven't read Liz Wiseman's book, it's called Multipliers, and it's awesome. The key concept that Debbie and I are talking about is a multiplier leader. I'll give you an example, actually. So, a multiplier leader would enter a meeting and would be curious, ask great questions, try to bring out the genius that's in the room, not through leading questions, but like genuine curiosity of trying to understand and maybe add a little bit of information in that's context that they only have as the leader. When they leave the meeting, what would be heard is, it's really great that Debbie dropped by to be in this meeting. She has some great questions. Really appreciate she was here. I think we came up with the right approach to this. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
if a diminisher leader walks in the room, and I'll be the leader for this one, and they said, oh, Mike came into the room and he sort of controlled the agenda. He told us whatever all of us needed to do. He gave us the answers. So that was a really quick and efficient meeting. It's so good that he was here. We probably should have him in all these conversations moving forward. And so what's happened there is, as a leader, I have diminished the conversation. Whereas in the conversation that Debbie was in, Debbie has multiplied it by creating capacity in the room, by telling people that they are capable, by asking them great questions, and effectively acting like a coach to a group. And so Liz Wiseman was like, you need to make a decision. Like, do you really, really want to be the smartest person in the room? Because you're going to diminish the capability of the people that work for you. And you're going to need a lot more time and energy to get things done in your organization, because you're going to be a glorified individual contributor. You're not actually going to lead people. Whereas a
Mm-hmm.
multiplier walks in and thinks, I'm here to develop the capacity of this team. And the analogy that I would use is like, people ask me sometimes, like, how can I become a better leader? I'm like, well, tell me about your team. And like, why do you want to know about my team? And I'm like, because if you're the boat in the water, the team is the tide.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
if you want the boat to float higher, work on the tide. Make the tide go higher, because it's the only way boats float any higher in the water. And so, right? Like, and so, I mean, I guess if an
Exactly.
empty boat floats a little higher, but the overall analogy still works, right? And so the focusing on your team first and thinking, not how do I become smarter or how do I gain knowledge? And I'm all for, growth and development. Obviously, I live in this world. And I think not enough time is spent thinking about the tide, and too much time is spent thinking about our boat.
Yeah. Oh, you know, I'm so glad that we started off talking about burnout, because the way that we solve for burnout is really all the things we just talked about, right? It's about
Yeah.
the boundaries and having empathy for ourselves, leading with bravery and vulnerability and seeing it as a strength. And this part here about coaching and asking the right questions so that our teams can take that forward. It's really it's not a, I don't want to say it's a secret sauce. It's not, there's nothing secret about it. But I think
Mm-hmm.
what makes it hard for people to do is because we get in our own way. We're all trying things to be perfect and trying to do it all. And that's not the most sustainable way. Yeah.
I think the thing that lands with me in everything you've said, Debbie, is like, I think when people hear about burnout or hear about resilience, they're like, well, if I just like go to the gym more often, if I eat healthier, if I sleep more, like that's the trick. Then I'll be able to like go at work, and that'll build my resilience. And the reality is that things like perfectionism and things like taking on too many things, not having boundaries, those are actually at the root cause of burnout. Now, things like,
Yes.
eating well and exercising and sleeping really do help to build up our resilience. But I can tell you from personal experience that even doing all those things well, it's still possible to burn out at work. I've seen it with myself and I've seen it with others where the capacity to try to do everything at this ultimate level, the equation, the math doesn't work. It just doesn't work in our favor. And so uh, the tools and techniques that you and I have talked about today, those are the ones that practically I know for myself, and I know for leaders that we coach and guide, that those work. And they come back and they're like, I have a different life, but it took practicing those things for a while before I got to the mindset shift.
Yeah.
Because when you told me about them, I didn't like, I kind of believed you enough that I'd go try it. But in the back of my mind, I'm like, this is never going to work. Right. And then they get the habits in place and they're like, I can't believe I used to think the way I used to think. I have these habits now that have changed my mindset. And yet, if I just read about it and I hadn't tried the things that you and I just talked about, Debbie, then I would be still stuck in the same mindset. So then, no matter what I did, my mindset would draw me back into a series of behaviors that would push me back into a place of feeling overwhelmed and feeling burnt out.
Exactly. Yeah. Good points you raised there. And, there was a really interesting study that Microsoft did, the Work Trend Index. And the statistics show that 68% struggle with the pace and volume of work. And of the 68%, 46% of them feel burnt out. And this study
Wow.
was sharing about how the one thing that gets people out of burnout is for them to see their own opportunities. So I love that. I love that there is hope here. It's not all doom and gloom. And
Yeah.
the hope here is getting out of our own ways, establishing the right boundaries, the mindset shift, all that, and seeing the opportunity for yourself instead of trying to do it all. It's not sustainable.
I really appreciate you being in this conversation, Debbie. I thank you so much for your time today. I love that we were able to, start from this place of, as you say, burnout, and then get through talking about the things that you and I both know practically work. And you've got a large enough leader population that you work with, as do I, that we know that when you put these into place, that the outcomes are going to be there for people. So hopefully listeners will take something, even one of the things that we talked about today, and apply that to their day-to-day role as a leader. Because I know from all of our conversations that when you do these things, you live a very different life at work day to day. So thank you
Definitely.
again for making time to be here. It means a lot to me.
Thank you. This was great. Really appreciate it.